Hey guys, welcome to my channel. My name is Melissa Siegel and I'm a professor of migration studies, and this is a channel about all things migration. Today we're continuing with our country series, specifically looking at Singapore. And while in my last video I focused on the history of migration in the Singaporean context, now we're going to specifically look at migration policies in Singapore, really a short history but focusing mostly on what's going on today. And what you'll see is that the main focus of Singaporean immigration policy is really having to do with labor immigration policies in the country today. So during decolonization and after independence, there were several key legislations on immigration management that were introduced. The first was the 1963 Immigration Act. And this was the first real migration act in the country that made irregular entry unlawful and also made overstaying of visas also punishable by fines and jail terms. So now is when real restrictions came into place. In 1987, there was the implementation of the worker levy system and dependency ceilings. And in 1991, there was the Employment of Foreign Workers Act, with a number of other acts that followed up to that. Also the 2005 fees regulation, which plays into this. So this is really all just building up the policy, mainly around labor immigration. So there are differential work permits and integration requirements depending on the type of labor migrant. Much of the requirements for obtaining passes center around salary amounts and qualification levels. So there are three main important tiers with regard to labor immigration. There's first the work pass, and that is for lower skilled labor migrants. They're also required to complete a one-day settling in program in Singapore and have the least amount of rights. Then you have the S-Pass, which is for mid-level skilled migrants, and they need to have a salary of at least $2,500 a month to qualify for this visa. Then you have the Employment Pass, which is meant for higher skilled migrants, and there's no kind of integration program necessary for this pass, and as we'll see later, this group also has a lot of additional perks. So it's been very important for Singapore to try to attract and retain highly skilled migrants from around the world. Highly skilled migrants are often referred to as foreign talents, and there's an aggressive recruitment for this foreign talent. There was an easing of requirements for permanent residency and citizenship for this group, offering of scholarships and research fellowships, improving living and cultural attractions for expatriates, and improving tax regimes for this group. There's also been the establishment of several institutions to facilitate the inflow of foreign talent. In 1995, there was the Foreign Talent Unit of the Prime Minister's Office that was renamed later in 1998 to the International Talent Division under the Ministry of Manpower. In 1997, there was the Contact Singapore section that was under the Ministry of Manpower, and that was relaunched again in 2008 as the New Contact Singapore, extending the engagement to overseas highly skilled Singaporeans also. In 1998, there was also created the Singapore Talent Recruitment Committee, and in 1999, the Manpower 21 Group under the Ministry of Manpower, and in 1999, the International Manpower Program under the Economic Development Board under the Ministry of Manpower. So several different layers here, all with the focus to facilitate the inflow of foreign talent. There are also programs for students and trainees and family reunification also. So there's a student pass for full-time study in Singapore. There's also a training employment pass that is more for trainees. There's also a holiday work pass and a training work permit for semi-skilled trainees. Additionally, for those seeking for family reunification as a non-citizen, they are allowed under the dependency pass or the long-term visits pass. And these passes are only permissible for spouses or children of eligible S pass, so this is the mid-skilled migrants, or the employment pass, which are the highly skilled migrants. So the lower skilled migrants actually have no rights to family reunification or formation. With a citizen's permit or residence permit, you may bring your spouse or unmarried children below the age of 21 years old as permanent residents. Now, as far as permanent residency is concerned, there are a number of work requirements. You either need to be a spouse of a citizen or a permanent resident. You need to be unmarried but legally recognized as a child, or you need to be unmarried and legally recognized as a child below 21 of either a spouse of a citizen or a permanent resident. You could also be the aged parent of the spouse of a citizen. There are also holders of employment passes or S passes have the right also to permanent residency, and students studying in Singapore, people on foreign investor visas in Singapore. And there's no minimum required length of stay for many of these groups. But if you get permanent residency, you do have to serve in the national or military service of Singapore, which can be a deterrent for people. If we look specifically at citizenship requirements, you have to have been a permanent resident for at least 2 years and above the age of 21, or have been a permanent resident for 2 years and been married to a citizen for at least 2 years, or you have to be an unmarried but legally recognized child below 21 years old of a citizen. And if studying in Singapore and have been residing in Singapore for more than 3 years and passed at least one national exam. So here, students also can get access to citizenship if they've been living in Singapore for at least 3 years and passed one of the national exams. Also, aging parents of citizens also have the possibility to become citizens in the country. However, dual citizenship in general is not allowed in the country, and if a child is born to parents with 2 different nationalities, the child will have to renounce one of these nationalities by the time they turn 22 years old. And again, if someone gains citizenship, they will have to serve in national or military service. Now, there's this very specific national service obligation for permanent residents and citizens in the country. And what is this? It means that all male citizens and permanent residents are required to serve national service, which is or compulsory military service, starting at the earliest opportunity upon reaching 18 years old, which lasts approximately 2 years. And upon completion, they are required to serve up to 40 days per year until the age of 40 to 50 years old, depending on the rank. So this is actually quite a heavy kind of side effect or service obligation in Singapore. It is the case that actually quite a lot of people have renounced their permanent residency status so as not to have to do this national service. But if this is the case, then they will not be allowed to get another permit later on. If we now turn towards diaspora engagement policies in the country, what we've actually seen is that since the 1990s, the country has been concerned with reducing so-called brain drain, or the migration of highly skilled people who don't necessarily come back to the country afterwards. There are a significant number of overseas abroad not returning after their studies, and this is something that does concern the Singaporean government. There's also been quite a switch in how the Singaporean government sees their migrants abroad or their diaspora abroad. In 2002, the Prime Minister actually stated that there were 2 categories of Singaporeans: stayers and quitters. But that changed drastically already in 2003 and from 2003 on. In 2003, there was the launch of the 21 Singapore to view brain drain instead as brain circulation and try to make sure that there was actually a circulation and a return of Singaporeans who had gone abroad, with the idea of hoping to activate contribution in Singapore also while abroad, but then when coming back also. Since the 1990s, also, there have been state-sponsored scholarships for studying abroad and then a return upon graduation to serve in Singapore afterwards. There are many policies offering highly skilled immigrants top positions also in public sector if they return. In 2013, there was the Returning Singaporean Science Scheme, offering researchers abroad leadership positions in universities and institutes. And there are a lot of kind of one-off policies here and there to try to attract back highly skilled people, highly skilled Singaporeans back to Singapore. So as one example, in 2019, there was a one-time very large cash grant for returning Singaporeans looking to become professors in the National University of Singapore. Now, once migrants that have gone abroad do return, what is the situation for reintegration? Well, returning migrants tend to be highly skilled, holding higher capacity to return voluntarily and reintegrate with the resources they hold. So there's actually not a lot of policies with regard to return and reintegration. For children in the education system, though, there is an immersion program for children returning home for a short while. There's a leave of absence scheme for readmittance to school directly upon return and identifying the time abroad as a leave of absence. And there's the boarding award scheme, which provides a living space for children whose parents are abroad. If we look now at irregular migration, since Singapore is an island nation, it is easier to control irregular migration and to control the inflow and outflow due to the type of borders that Singapore has. There have been rapid improvements in tracking technology that led to a decrease in the number of visa overstayers. And in 2019, the government only found 932 irregular entries and visa overstayers in the country. So there was more of a crackdown on irregular migration, but it has become easier and easier to control with new technologies and the fact of the specific types of borders in the countries. Now, as far as policies with regard to asylum and refugee status, so I already explained in the previous video on the history of migration in Singapore that there were asylum seekers previously from Vietnam between 1978 and 1996 that were largely dealt with by UNHCR, and these were all resettled to third countries or repatriated. Currently, there's actually no asylum policy in Singapore. And Singapore is not signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention or 67 Protocol. There's also no data on attempted asylum applications in Singapore. And the official stance of the government on asylum seeking is that Singapore is not in a position to accept any person seeking political asylum or refugee status in the country. So the reasons that they have stated for this stance of not accepting refugees is a lack of space and natural resources in the country, and that they also don't want to upset the racial balance that they currently have in the country. As a result, any asylum seekers who enter without a valid travel documents will be recognized as irregular migrants and subject to detention and corporal punishment as per the 1959 Immigration Act. So there are also a very low number of asylum seekers that leave the country. In 2018, there were 48 asylum seekers from Singapore. The number of acceptances is usually withheld from the public, both from the destination and the origin countries, but reasons for asylum seeking that have been mentioned are the discrimination of ethnic minorities, unwillingness to complete obligatory military service, political repression, and fleeing debt. As far as human trafficking is concerned, due to the high inflow of migrants in geographical locations, as a natural port, Singapore is a destination and transit for trafficked victims. There are two main types of trafficking in Singapore, those for economic activity, so this is with the deception of working conditions, confiscation of passports and debt bondage, and also sex trafficking into sex work. The most common countries of origin for victims of trafficking are China, the Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, Cambodia, and Malaysia. As far as human trafficking or anti-human trafficking actions are concerned, in 2010, the Trafficking in Persons Intra-Agency Task Force was set up. And in 2015, there was the Prevention Against Human Trafficking Act, with penalties up to 10 years of imprisonment and a large fine. However, prior to 2019, the low number of prosecutions in Singapore put Singapore on the US Tier 2 list of countries who do not meet the minimum required standards for the elimination of trafficking. However, luckily in 2020, Singapore ascended to Tier 1 due to an increase in the number of investigations and convictions that took place in the country. Now, as far as regional or international activity, Singapore is part of ASEAN, and ASEAN refers to the cooperation between member states, which is including Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos. But most of the areas that they work on have non-binding regional or international instruments, and they stay largely out of the migration realm, and it's where migration is really seen as a domestic issue for the ASEAN nations. Now, as far as main international conventions that Singapore is a signatory to, there's really only the ASEAN Convention Against Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, that they have ratified in 2016, and the United Nations Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, in 2015. On the non-signatory side, there are quite a few more. So they have not they have not been the signatory to a lot of the ILO conventions around migration, not to the Migration for Employment Convention or the Migrant Workers Convention, also not the International Convention for the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members and Their Families. And they were also not a signatory to the Global Compact for Migration, which is probably the most important compact and international agreement around migration, next to the 1951 Refugee Convention and 1967 Protocol, which they're also not signatory to. They're also not signatory to the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights of 1953. I hope this gives you just a very quick overview of the policy situation in Singapore. It's very clear that most of the policies are really focused around labor immigration and the different rights and responsibilities that each of those groups have, although citizenship and permanent residency play an important role, and diaspora engagement is getting more and more important for the country also. If you haven't done so already, check out the video on the history of migration in Singapore and the video on the current modern day situation of migration in the country. I'll see you next time.